Hi, my name is Valentina Pulido, and I will be talking about experimental psychology and the Little Albert experiment. Psychology is the study of how the mind works and our behavior. Experimental psychologists perform research studies in order to collect data. The Little Albert experiment of the 1920s is one of the most spine-chilling and impactful psychology studies ever done. Experimental psychology is very interesting and beneficial to society. Experimental psychologists or research psychologists seek to find the answers to questions about our perception, cognition, emotions, and more. Data collected from the Little Albert experiment has influenced the psychology since the 1920s. The Little Albert experiment was a psychology study performed by John B. Watson and was a Lee Rainier on a 9-month-old infant in order to find out more about classical conditioning. I will be first discussing about how the Little Albert experiment was performed, then some ethical issues and criticisms, and finally, how the experiment impacted research psychology. So let's start with the experiment. What happened with Little Albert? Little Albert was a 9-month-old chosen for Watson's and Rainier's experiment in their search to find out about the association between different stimuli and how it affects our behavior. In other words, classical conditioning. The university, according to psychology researcher of the University of Manchester, Saul McLeod, classical conditioning is learning through association and was discovered by Pavlov, a Russian psychologist. In simple terms, two stimuli are linked together in order to form a learned new response in a person or an animal. Little Albert was introduced to a series of stimuli which he showed no fear or unusual response to at first. The stimuli were things like newspaper, a monkey, and a white rat. Next, the researchers exposed Little Albert to the white rat, but this time they made a loud noise which frightened Little Albert. The researchers repeatedly made a loud noise every time they exposed Little Albert to the white rat. Little Albert soon began to expect a frightening noise every time he saw the rat, and he soon began to cry and fear the rat every time he saw it, even if there was no sound paired with it. What's interesting about the experiment is that Little Albert was not only conditioned to fear the white rat, but other furry white animals too. So not only was he conditioned to be phobic towards the rat, but a furry white mask or a white rabbit, for example. So let's take a look at why Little Albert's experiment is now considered unethical. The experiment induced a lot of stress on Little Albert. To start off, the Little Albert experiment would have not be permitted in today's experiment standards in psychology due to the unethical conditions in which it was performed. Neuropsychologist at the University of Amsterdam, Alexander Burgers-Meester, reported the experiment failed to include adequate control conditions, and most importantly, it affected psychologically Little Albert. Due to the experiment, Little Albert had developed an intense phobia against furry white animals. As one can imagine, this must have traumatized the child. Watson and Rainier did not take the proper steps to psychologically heal Little Albert or uncondition him from his phobia. Watson received a lot of backlash, and he burned the papers that revealed Little Albert's true identity, so people weren't able to find out how he developed later on in his life. Was the experiment worth traumatizing Little Albert? The impact of Little Albert's experiment in the field of psychology. Thanks to the data collected by the researchers in the Little Albert experiment, we now know a lot more about how the mind associates different stimuli and how that may affect us. This information is useful because it gives us scientists insight on how the mind works and how it can be used in the future in ethical experiments for more psychological research. Of course, it also taught experimental psychologists the importance of ethical testing in order to not harm the subject when performing an experiment. All in all, this study ultimately changed experimental psychology. Albert definitely left his mark on research psychology. Watson and Rainier performed an unethical experiment on little Albert due to its controversial procedures that caused little Albert psychological trauma. The data collected because of this case was very influential and one of the most talked about experiments in research psychology. Due to its unethical methods, experimental psychologists now know what steps to make in order to avoid harming a subject in an experiment. This is how little Albert impacted psychology.